Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Jank Tank. This is episode number 12. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be your host today. It is a crisp 0 degrees outside where I live.
Wow.
I, as a person, have more degrees than the weather right now, which is absolutely wild to me. You know, as a former North Carolinian, former Texan, being in negative degree weather this week has just been something completely wild. I believe it is the first time in my life I have experienced negative degree weather. It's crazy. But anyway, enough about my life. We've got here on the line with me both the boys. They're back. We've got Teld and Chris. How's it going, gentlemen?
It's going, man.
Yeah, it's going all right. I was a little sick for the last couple of days, but I'm feeling better today, so.
Seems to happen a lot. Is that a byproduct of teaching?
It is, yeah. You're just constantly exposed to whatever the newest flavor of cold and flu is.
Yet another upside of being a teacher. The pay is great.
Yeah.
You never get sick. Society rewards you for your efforts.
Quit your job, please, and start teaching right now. As a former teacher, I was sick way more often during those 3 years than I was during the rest of my time.
It's like all the worst aspects of having children, except they're not even yours.
I know, right? And they throw stuff at you. Anyway, that might have been just my experience, but
I teach at high school too, so they're in that lovely rebellious phase where everything is stupid.
Yeah,
they're becoming like half clever, which makes them half dangerous. You know.
I don't know. Mine are not particularly clever. They'll find one joke that they like and repeat it 500 times. That's just
come on, they're listening to the Jank Tank right now. To all Teld students listening to the Jank Tank episode 12 right now, he didn't mean it. He has your best interest in mind.
He loves you all individually exactly as much as the next one.
Yeah, teachers definitely don't play favorites. You definitely don't have students.
No, definitely not. Good to have both of you on the line. Mop really held down the fort last week. I enjoyed having a conversation with him about our alternative cubes in the Jank Diver Gaming
It was a good episode.
Group. It was. Sounds like you listened to it. You heard a couple crack shots that we took at various.
That's the only reason that I listen to episodes that I'm not on is just to see how many times you guys took the piss out of me.
Yeah, and I do have to apologize. Teld was really what do the students say? Out of pocket? Am I using that correctly? Teld's just completely unhinged when you're not here. So I'm glad you're back. It's kind of like reuniting the Triforce, right? I like having both you guys on.
Who has to wear the floppy green hat though?
Oh, I volunteer. I volunteer. I volunteer myself as tribute. Anyway, story time. Today we're kicking off a series that we're going to call the Build a Cube series. This will be part 1. When Chris and I used to do the Deep Dive podcast, I think it was definitely our most popular series of episodes during that 30 episode run that we did. But we started something also called the Build a Cube series. And not only was it our most successful episodes, but I think it was some of the episodes we had the most fun discussing between the two of us, actually talking about how we design cubes and how we would recommend other people designing cubes. And we decided to port that over to the Jank Tank for a couple reasons. First off, it's been over 2 years since Chris and I recorded those episodes, and we have a lot of fresh new perspectives on cube design, and what we would do now is probably very different than what we would do 2.5 years ago. And also we have Teld with us, who has his own insights that he can add to this. So what we were originally thinking about doing was maybe just finding the old recordings, dredging them up, and putting them on YouTube, and not re-recording them, but just presenting them as are, with the caveat that, these were 2 to 3 years old. Our ideas were a little bit dated, but we decided, we've got Teld here, we've got fresh perspectives on things. Let's go ahead and kick this series off again, and let's just go ahead and modernize it for, how we're actually thinking about Cube. And we actually did this back in, I think, October, November. I don't remember when we recorded the episode, but we recorded an episode we were very happy about to kick this off, and due to post-audio problems.
You can say it was my fault. You can say it was my fault.
Look, if you're going to dox yourself, I felt like I kept it intentionally vague, but
I don't know why. I just, I feel like this is my way of taking responsibility for it, is just letting everybody know that I fucked up.
It wasn't really that big of a deal. It was an audio issue, and it led to us not being able to release that episode. So we wanted to distance ourselves from the episode a little bit because it just felt super inorganic for us to jump right back into it and record the same exact thing. So we're like 3 or 4 months down the line. It feels like it's a little bit more fresh in our mind. So we're going to kick this series off. We are not going to go sequentially, but we will periodically release extra episodes to this Build a Cube series and have it kind of be like an entire series spread out across a couple episodes. That being said, our very first episode here is going to be very nuts and bolts, mechanical, kind of how to do basic cube design. This is going to be our attempt at an evergreen style episode for anyone who's literally building a cube for the first time. And I know people who talk about this a lot with the success of CubeCon over the last couple years. There are more and more people out there who are saying, I want to build a cube. I want to try to build a cube for the first time. And we want to make sure we put our stamp on how we would do that. Starting off with this episode, basic cube design. Nothing flashy here.
This episode is just kind of like, it's about sort of like framing what you want out of your cube design experience. The following episode, we're actually going to do like what I would personally refer to as nuts and bolts, which is like figuring out your densities, like setting up your structure, whatever. And then the third episode is going to be moving into introducing new themes, making sure the room is tied together, like the sort of finishing touches. Like, what do you want to sculpt? Sculpting out the basic shape, polishing it up.
Yeah. This first one is going to be, I mean, we're going to do our best not to just read notes off a page, but it's kind of just the checklist of things you need to know about if you're building a cube, whereas we're going to talk about actual design philosophy a little bit more moving forward. And I know Chris has a lot of ideas. He presented a lot of his own ideas. He's laughing. That wasn't a jab. You know, Chris and his goddamn ideas all the time.
He submitted me 7 different cube lists for just mono black cubes.
Oh my god. I believe that actually happened. I don't think that's a joke.
I'm lying to you, but it wouldn't surprise me if I did.
Well, anyway, extending the intro even further, why don't one of you guys go ahead and talk to me and just get people started with the resources that they need to know. I assume most people know a lot of these by now, but if somebody is here because they are literally building a cube for the first time, what websites do they need to know to get started?
Sure. So I think the first one that everybody needs to know about is Cube Cobra, and hopefully most people do at this point know about that website. But if you're a Magic boomer who, I don't even know if Cube Tutor is still even around.
I think it's down.
I think it went down.
Okay, yeah. Cube Cobra is better regardless. It's updated regularly. It's got way more tools. It's basically just a place to log your cube list where you can update it. You can do all kinds of stuff. They have analytic tools for you. You can filter by different, dozens of different things to kind of check and curate your cube. So that's just what you want to have to keep a list. Even if you have a paper cube, it would make more sense to have that list online so that you can kind of tool around with that instead of having to just keep completely track of it in paper. So that would be the first one, and that's just a basic maintenance sort of website.
Yeah, and everything we're talking about in these episodes applies to paper cubes. I know we do all of our cubing in the digital space, but a lot of what we're talking about, 95% of what we're going to talk about applies to paper cube as well as digital cubing. How about that Scryfall, though? Scryfall is insane. Scryfall.com is like the best Magic the Gathering tool on the internet, I think. Like, I use it for my work so much, and the amount of stuff you can do with Scryfall for just a simple search engine for Magic cards is ridiculous. I did an article for thegamer.com, which was top 10 cards based on Black Lotus, and I wanted to look for all of the cards that had lotuses in them, and you can type in like art:"lotus, and it'll bring up every card that has a lotus in the art of the card. Like,
I did not know that. That's insanity.
That is wild, and somebody had to go code that.
Somebody at Scryfall is going through and doing like art tags. We're going to talk about set cubes. Like, if you did a Theros cube, you can type in art:"Theros, and it'll bring up every single card that has a character or a setting on Theros, even the ones outside of like actual Theros sets. Like, Scryfall is insane. Look, love you, Wizards of the Coast, but people do not use Gatherer.com for your searches. Just don't use Gatherer. embarrassing compared to Scryfall. So if you're looking for card images, if you're looking for things within a certain query, Scryfall.com is the place to go. Big shout out to the people there. I don't know how big their team is, but the way they keep up with everything, and they have good images, it's fantastic. Chris, talk to me about Draftmancer, which formerly was called MTG Draft.tk, I think, but now goes by Draftmancer.
Yeah. Which is a much catchier name. So Draftmancer, shout out to Senroku, who maintains it, created it, is an online tool that you can use to input any card set, whether it's your cube or a specific limited format or what have you, and then simulate a draft digitally for 8 or 10 or however many people that your cube supports. We use it extensively because the way that our cube is drafted, we draft here and then you export the lists into Arena and then we play through Direct Challenge. However, if you have a paper cube that you want to draft with your friends elsewhere in the country, you can do the draft through Draftmancer. I mean, it's really, really, really smooth. And then you can export your lists and play each other in cockatrice or whatever if you have a paper cube but you want to play with people who, aren't local. I'm sure that there is some other draft utility out there, but I'm just going to go ahead and say that without this tool, we don't exist.
Oh yeah.
It's really the best place to do this. If you're getting good use out of it, I think that there's a button there buy me a coffee, drop a couple bucks in there. The work that they do to maintain it is impressive, and it's just a really nice draft tool.
They even give some advertising for Jank Diver. We've had people come in to filter in through their website. So yeah, big shout out there.
Yeah, a lot, actually. I probably need to just reach out to them and personally thank them. But
yeah, Draftmancer is fantastic. Also, you can use the Reddit, the MTG Cube Reddit. This is Chris's area of expertise. I would rather trip up a staircase than spend time on Reddit these days. But the MTG Cube has enough conversation going on that if you have questions about things, there are usually people there to answer. And then I also wanted to just very quickly plug EDH Wreck, which it seems like a weird thing to talk about for Cube. But I've noticed myself go into this a lot when I'm looking for synergy pieces for cards. EDH Wreck is basically a commander tool that logs people's commander decks and then gives you stats based on how often certain cards are paired with certain commanders and stuff like that. But you can also, if you're looking, if you have a specific archetype or theme in mind, you can look up a card like a legendary creature, like a ninja or something like that, and just see all of the kind of synergy pieces that people use with it. So it's a good way to get juices flowing in terms of cards that work well with one another, even though it is mostly focused in the commander sphere. So you're going to get a lot of EDH relevant cards there, but it is going to give you a lot more of an idea of here's an instant that works well with this creature type that I didn't know about or didn't think about. And that's the type of thing that won't pop up through Scryfall. So that's kind of a last resort thing if you're just kind of reaching for synergy pieces and stuff like that.
I imagine this is more helpful for specific cubes, so stuff like your Affinity Cube, where you're looking for cards that interact favorably with artifacts. I'm also guessing that the more, in the last 10 years or so, Commander has gotten much more spiky from my understanding, and sure. that probably contributes to that being a more useful tool, right? As you're just getting more generically powerful cards on average.
Well, a good example is let's say we wanted to play the Aftermath Obnixilis, the one that says something whenever you deal a single damage to an opponent, you impulse draw a card. I don't remember exactly what it does, but if I Scryfall search for Obnixilis, all I'm going to get is that card, and I'm going to think to myself, well, what cards work with this Obnixilis? Well, that's where you can go to EDH Rec, type in the Obnixilis, and see the most commonly played cards with that commander, and that can give you some ideas for your cube, here's something I can seed for this Obnixilis that also works with this. So that's just a backup tool to keep in mind here, but just bear in mind it is a commander-focused tool, so it might not give you exactly what you're looking for. It's more of just an extra tool for research purposes and design purposes and stuff like that. So websites to know, those are very important, and I'm assuming most people who are here know the majority of those tools. But again, this is meant for the first-time cube designer. If you know exactly what you're doing with cube design, you've been doing this for years, this first episode probably isn't going to spark any super revolutionary ideas. But again, we are catered in this first part of the series mostly to people who are doing this for the first time. So with that being said, Chris, do you want to talk to me a little bit about identifying your goals for the environment, the things that you should be thinking about before you actually start gathering the cards for your cube?
Sure. So broadly speaking, the place that you should start is to think about the type of Magic that you like to play, or the people that you play Magic with like to play. And what I mean by that is, like, if you really, really enjoy combo, for example, like you're a big time Johnny, maybe you've played some like Vintage Cube, you're into that, that should inform kind of where you should be trying to go with your environment. Personally, I am not a combo enjoyer at all. I am a boring, vanilla, aggro, mid-range control as like the pillars of my environment type Magic player. That's the type of environment that we've cultivated. So there's just like a variety of things you could do if you want to try to approximate like the power level of like a master set limited environment. You could reach for like a peasant cube or artisan cube if you're familiar with like the arena parlance. If you're trying to go after like a traditional cube, which is just like good cardstock format, do you want an environment that really heavily emphasizes synergy over individual card quality? Do you want to do something? You could say gimmicky. I'm gonna go with the word novelty. Like you just really love black, so you want to make a mono black cube. Just first thing you need to identify is like, what do I enjoy about Magic? What type of Magic do I like to play? What type of cards do I enjoy the most? And that's kind of the first step towards identifying where you want to go. And then I think the second just kind of broad goal is like, and I guess this kind of feeds into what kind of Magic do I like to play. You should start thinking about like what kind of power level appeals to you. Are possible turn one wins something that you want in your cube? Or do you like sort of littered boards with like a lot of complex combat math, etc.? These are the things to be considering broadly before you really think about anything else.
Yeah, and I actually like the use of the term novelty cube there, because we talked a lot on the last episode about different cubes that have like really niche themes, and I think we called most of them gimmicks. And I think we were talking about Roja, Philly Brat's cube, and I think we referred to it as a gimmick cube. And then following that episode, Roja actually asked us, like, what do we mean by gimmick? I guess gimmick has kind of a negative connotation that we weren't really thinking about.
We're certainly not using it in a negative sense here. We mean it more as just like a concept that's very specific. It's got a gimmick, right? It's got a thing that it's trying to do. But yeah, generally speaking, I think in most parlance, you're going to see gimmick have kind of a negative connotation to it, so I can see why there may be an incentive to try and use some different language there.
Yeah, and Rohan knew what we were saying, but also wanted us to clarify like what we meant by gimmick cubes. But I will personally try to refer to them as novelty cubes, because that's more of a positive connotation. Yeah, if you've been watching, if you're somebody out there who's watching like LSV's Cube channel right now, and you see the, vintage/vintage light cubes that he's drafting, and you like that sort of thing, that's probably the power level you're going for. But if you don't care much for like all the combo-y stuff going on and the games that end super fast, then you can personally say to yourself, my cube is going to tone this down a little bit,
Death to combo.
Chris,
bring me combo's head.
And Chris, your whole shtick when we first started cubing was that you wanted the feel of retail limited without, the game end and rares that decide the games on their own, right? And I think that's how a lot of people actually come into Cube, is like, oh, I can recreate these sets that I like to play without the things that I don't like to play,
Right. That's a good example to kind of illustrate like the things that I just laid out. Like, what kind of Magic do you like to play? I basically only played set limited at the time, and I thought two things. I was like, okay, what if we took the sort of like novelty archetypes that are in most like limited sets that are kind of specific to that set, and made them like a little bit more general, a little bit more tied together, a little bit more powerful. I kind of wanted to play souped up limited. And the reason that I chose a peasant power level was I really didn't like that time that you flashed in Lyra Dawnbringer with Thran whatever portal on me.
I enjoyed
that game out of my mouth. I did not.
I had to play Thran Temporal Gateway, man. Like, give me some credit.
Okay, that's totally fair. So basically, like, my two goals coming into the environment, just as like an example to illustrate this, were I wanted the feel of limited, I wanted to soup up the power a little bit, and I wanted to eliminate the feeling of, oops, bomb rare, game is over. And that's how my first Peasant Cube came to be.
And just to be clear, rares aren't necessarily a power level increase. Sometimes they're more complex, but aren't actually better cards. I mean, it's
right.
For example, Immodane's Recruiter, we play in our Peasant Cube, and it is better than like half the rares on the Arena client. And so, just because a card is a common or uncommon doesn't mean it's going to be weaker, but there is more or less some intrinsic power banding there because the rares and mythics get a little more leeway to be busted.
A really good example of that is, I believe it's Anthony from Lucky Paper has a cube he maintains called Regular Cube, and it's meant to feature sort of quote-unquote like regular cards. He's kind of looking for, sort of a limited power level gameplay experience is my understanding, but he doesn't limit himself to just commons and uncommons. He'll play rares that are power level appropriate for a largely common and uncommon environment.
That does require an extra level of judiciousness and of experience generally with Magic to kind of know which rares are acceptable and which rares aren't. And sometimes you're not going to know until you start playing with them. But if you're feeling like you don't want to arbitrarily exclude rares, you don't have to, and you can still create kind of a retail level power level set.
Yeah, and those guys obviously know exactly what they're doing over there, so...
They've been at it a little while. I hear that they talk about it on the internet sometimes.
Yeah, you should check that out, Lucky Paper Magic. Specifically, one episode where they had on some guys from Jank Game, and I would listen to that one. That was a good episode. So real quick, I wanted to just put a little asterisk next to us talking about the budget, and then Teld, I would like for you to talk a little bit about cube classification, how people talk about like what their cube is, and put them in different buckets. But for our purposes, we do all of our drafting and cubing through Magic Arena, and we use Draftmancer, which is a free tool. Again, you can donate to Senryoku, and we urge you to do that, but it is a free tool on the internet. So we don't really have the same budgetary concerns that somebody who is building a paper cube would, and I imagine there's a small number of people who would be listening to this who are actually interested in building a paper cube to draft with their friends. But then you have to consider the budget. You have to consider how much you're willing to spend on cards. And of course, the glory of cubing is that it's a non-sanctioned thing. There's no tournament going on for the most part. So you can proxy. And I don't know if you guys have seen proxy websites lately, but you could make very nice proxies if you're willing to spend like a very small amount of money and just like not drop the, dollar amounts you need to on 360 cards plus tokens and basics and stuff like that.
As far as we're aware, no one from WotC is going to come arrest you if you use a $5 volcanic island versus a $1,000 volcanic island.
I have proxy dual lands in my own personal paper cube because I think dual lands just make games smoother, and I don't own any actual dual lands. So yeah, proxies are fine. Obviously, we can't proxy the way we do things. We have a different restriction, which is wild cards that we're not going to get into now. But there are budget considerations. You have to know ahead of time, like, how much am I willing to spend on my cube? And one thing to keep in mind is you also need to buy sleeves, right? The smallest cube that most people build is 360 cards. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you've got to consider 360 cards plus the sleeves for all of the basics, which is usually another 100 to 120, 130, basic lands that you need to have on hand. That's almost 500 sleeves that you need that all have to match. You usually want them to be high quality so that they survive shuffling over different sessions and stuff like that. And a lot of times you want to double sleeve them. You want your cube to be pristine for the people playing. So there are budget considerations, and that's a lot of the impetus for people building like artisan cubes and pauper cubes and stuff like that, is that it's just cheaper. It's just cheaper to buy lower rarity cards for the most part. So not something we concern ourselves with. We get to just play whatever's on Arena. We have a restricted card pool, but we just get to play anything without considering its monetary worth. That might be something you need to sit down and plan out. And if I were you, I would set a budget before I go looking at cards and stick to that budget. Because once you go down the rabbit hole of actually picking out cards and then just be like, oh, I'll pay for whatever this is, you're going to end up with some pretty expensive pieces floating around. So set the budget first. And
you could also just do something like, I'm not going to put any cards in this cube that cost more than like $1 or $1.50.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to give you an example of the kind of flexibility you can have if you're willing, especially if you're willing to not have those absolute top tier cards. So last I looked, Fable the Mirror Breaker was running about $15 to $20, right? It's one of the most powerful cards printed in the last few years. But if you take a step down, and not even really a step down, but something like Lelia the Blade Reforged is also ridiculously powerful, costs about $5. And then something like Breach's Eager Pillager, which is a card we didn't include in our unrestricted cube because we thought it might be a little too good. You know, we've had some pushback on that, but you can get a Breaches for 49 cents. You can get a Bone Crusher Giant for 28 cents. You know, there are a lot of very powerful cards that if you're willing to take a step down from those top tier kind of constructed cards and play cards that are a little less played, maybe slightly less powerful, you can save huge amounts of money. So if you're on a budgetary concern, think about that before you go and spend $20 on Fable the Mirror Breaker, when you could get maybe 10 or 15, 20 cards for your cube that are all going to add a lot to the texture of the environment as opposed to that Fable.
Yeah, and just go back and pick up your Fable in a couple of years when the price goes down.
Yeah, exactly. Or proxy that bad boy up. It's worth maybe following, if this is something you really care about and you want to play with the good cards, it's maybe worth following some of the MTG Finance stuff going on out there. But, you know, if you wait for a card to release like 3 weeks after a standard release is usually, you know, the cards are dirt cheap. That's when to get them. Don't try to buy them during pre-releases and stuff like that. I'm not going to go into it now, but just a little bow on this topic. Budget is something to highly consider if you plan on cubing a lot in the future. Like if the thing that you're putting together is something that you want to be in good condition and you want it to look good and you want players to be excited about playing it, you probably need to expend just a little bit of money to kind of get it together. But once it's built, and then it's just all about upgrading over time. So moving on from that point, Tel, do you want to talk a little bit about cube classification, some of the terms that people throw around when they're talking about like the type of cubes that they have?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm going to start with the ones that are most relevant to our environment. And firstly, that would be historic. So when people say historic, that is the arena card pool. Though it has kind of changed a little bit. They now have what is called timeless, which is sort of arena vintage in a sense. It's going to be the most powerful arena format. But more specifically, it has a second caveat, which actually makes our unrestricted cube a timeless cube in a funny sense, in that timeless is going to be the original, unnerfed, unchanged, unalchemied versions of paper cards, and then whatever the current iteration of alchemy cards are. So if you haven't played with any of the alchemy cards, they have changed some iconic cards or some various cards that exist in paper to different forms. One of them was like Omnath, I think is now like a 5-mana card in alchemy. But in our environment, we play the original 4-mana Omnath, even if we include alchemy cards. So while we do label our cube as a historic cube, it doesn't technically meet the requirements of historic cube because it is we don't play any of the alchemy cards. But we do generally call it a historic cube because that's kind of the card pool we see to pull from.
And we might, not to interrupt, but we might actually want to start referring to this as the timeless card pool instead of the historic card pool, because timeless just encompasses the entirety of what's on Arena.
Or just the Arena card pool, which literally encompasses everything that's on Arena.
These all mean the same thing.
We're going to have to start calling the timeless cube the unrestricted cube, and the unrestricted cube is going to be the restricted cube. So then there is what we call unpowered. Sometimes you hear it as legacy unpowered. And this is going to be your eternal card pool with no set restrictions, but it will have power level concerns. So there will be cards that are specifically excluded, almost always cards like the Power 9, but also cards like Mishra's Workshop or Tolarian Academy, these cards that produce an immense amount of mana. Some of the most ridiculous threats will also be excluded. And then to compare to that, you have Vintage Powered, which is where you bring in those top 35 cards ever printed level power cards. And those are kind of blurry lines as well, because outside of the Power 9, there's a colloquial set of power where people acknowledge cards as power cards, but they don't necessarily fall into that traditional Power 9 classification.
Like Time Vault. Time Vault's a great example of a quote-unquote a card that probably makes your cube a powered cube. A lot of people remove Time Vault from theirs, and it's also worth noting, like, the vintage cube, the one that people play on Magic Online, probably the most drafted cube of all time anywhere. that is kind of like the standard for what a vintage cube is, and you do see the Power 9 there. But even then, I think I don't know if Time Vault's in the online vintage cube.
It hasn't been in a long time. Time Vault is a card that even in the most powerful of environments, people will frequently pass over because it is the easiest card in the game to break with a stiff breeze.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, it is so ridiculously easy to break that card, and it instantly wins. It works inside fair shells, works inside unfair shells. Just very, very silly card.
Yeah, Legacy and Vintage Cubes basically have an unrestricted card pool in terms of, like, there's no set restrictions or anything like that. You will hear some people who keep things pure. They want to be purists, so they remove commander and supplementary product from their cubes, but for the most part, when you hear someone talk about a vintage or legacy cube, it just means that they're not restricting themselves to any particular card pool, and then powered versus unpowered is kind of a check on, you know, how strong the cards are going to be or what the upper limits of the most powerful cards are going to be in those cubes.
Now, historically speaking, one of the differentiators between like legacy and vintage or powered and unpowered is that unpowered cubes tend to be a little more board centric, while powered cubes tended to be a little more stack centric. That has changed over the years, but powered cube still tends to have this sort of weird metagame where cards that generate value onto the board, like Young Pyromancer, are a lot better in a powered cube than they are in an unpowered cube, because there's a lot less cards playing to the board to block them, and there's more things to do with those tokens. Stuff like disenchants are much more powerful in your powered cube environment, where you have things like Moxes floating around. So they do have these contextually different sort of game plans. Beyond that, there's format legality cubes, so what we would call like a modern cube, Pioneer Cube, we have the Standard Cube that me and Fletcher work on. So these are formats that are based on what the card pool allows. Modern Cube is really popular. From what I understand, it's one of the more popular of the non-traditional, like powered, unpowered cubes. People like it because it tends to be a little more creature and planeswalker focused and more representative of modern Magic. Beyond that, there's stuff like set or plane cubes. So things like our Neo Cube. You have stuff like the various Innistrad cubes that pull from all the Innistrad sets. You have true set cubes where people try to recreate the retail limited environment inside their cube.
Yeah, think about the remastered sets that are coming out in paper over the last couple of years, like Ravnica Remastered and Dominaria Remastered. Those are an attempt to pull a bunch of different cards from a bunch of different sets that take place on the same plane and kind of have the same aesthetic to them and the same, you know, mechanics / themes and stuff like that, and combine them all in one place. So you will see people sometimes with like Ravnica cubes, and Ravnica now has, I don't know, 10, 11 sets that are all based on Ravnica, plus like any supplementary product that references Ravnica, and you pull them all into one spot for this like nice aesthetically appealing cube, which, you know, the gameplay might vary depending on what the different themes of the sets you're pulling from are, but it's not too hard to make things a little bit, you know, not too hard to make things cohesive when you're doing a set cube. It's more of like a passion project. If you love Innistrad's your favorite set in Magic, you can build an Innistrad cube. You might not be able to do it for like, you can't build like an Ikoria cube unless you're just building like a redesign of Ikoria, you know, because there's only one Ikoria set. But for these planes that have been referenced over and over and over again that we revisit every 3 or 4 years, you'll see people who are really passionate about those planes build cubes around them.
Yeah, and then the final main classification of cubes are the Rarity Restricted cubes. And we've mentioned a little bit about this, but you've got Pauper, which is all commons. You've got Peasant or Artisan, which is commons, uncommons. And then what we call the unrestricted environment, which is you use rares, mythics, whatever you want, and you're trying to balance around different metrics.
An important note there, if you are a first-time cube designer and you are not familiar with the terms like Pauper, Peasant, Artisan, stuff like that, there is kind of a rule of thumb that if you are in the community, if you are building a Pauper cube that is all commons, you are allowed to play any card that has ever been printed at uncommon or at common, even if the exact version you have is an uncommon or a rare, right? So a good example of like an artisan cube card would be like Palaka Worm, right? You might own the M19 Palaka Worm, which has a rare symbol on it, which makes it feel like it's not peasant or artisan legal, but Palaka Worm has been printed as an uncommon in multiple printings, so it is a peasant legal version. It doesn't matter what the actual symbol on the card you have is, as long as it has ever been printed at the rarity that you are restricting yourself to, it is it's fair game.
There's also been some pushback on our particular peasant cube because we elect to not run the uncommon, common like gain lands. We run real mana bases with rare lands. We don't run anything that has like an activated ability at rare. It's all just cards that produce strictly mana. But we have had some people mention that technically makes our peasant cube not a peasant cube, but it makes the gameplay a lot better. And the only reason lands aren't rare is to sell packs. So that is a one exception we do make.
Small compromise. That, and I mean, majority of players who are playing on Arena, the first thing they have in their collection are the dual lands from every set, right? It's the thing you need if you play Constructed. So it usually doesn't hurt our drafters very much, but... So, Chris, do you want to go ahead and get into talking about some of the cube sizes here, starting off with maybe like the most common, working our way up, and talking about what the advantages and disadvantages of different cube sizes is?
Sure. So I think probably like the original cube size would be 360 cards. This is the exact same size as a box that you would draft at F&M. So it's exactly the same structure of draft. 8 players, 3 packs of 15 cards. The reason that I like this cube size so much, there's no variance in terms of what is opened. So everything is going to be opened every time you draft with a full pot of 8. So it is a lot more consistent to be able to draft towards strategies, right? If I open a pack 1, pick 1, and Yawgmoth is in the pack, I know that, at least in our cube, Vran, Executioner Thane, Blood Artist, Meathook Massacre, and Bastion of Remembrance, Woe Strider, Ophiomancer, all of these cards that are like really amazing in the Yawgmoth strategy, they're all going to get opened. And if that deck is open, there's a good chance I'm going to get most of them, right? We play Dreadhorde Arcanist in our 360. If you are drafting a lot of 1-mana spells, you pick up like a Young Pyromancer or something, you can bias towards 1-mana spells knowing that a Dreadhorde Arcanist is definitely going to be opened, and if you cut off 1-mana spells and like Izzet lands, you're almost definitely going to see it, right? Like that card just doesn't work as well if you don't know it's going to be in the draft pool, for example. You can't support more than 8 players at a time with a 360. That can be a little problematic, but I would venture to guess that most play groups for Cube are not a whole lot larger than this. In fact, most of the posts that I see on the subreddit are like, how do I draft my Cube with 4 people? Kind of a thing.
Chris, I have a question for you. Are we supposed to change our cube size, the standard cube size, now that the retail limited packs are changing size? There's been some discussion of that in the community. I just wanted to get your opinion. Are we supposed to play 336 cards, 384 cards? Are we supposed to leave it at 360? What are we supposed to do?
I don't know. I haven't thought about that at all, to be honest with you. I don't feel the need to like mirror what they're doing in limited at all. I have seen people go to 384 specifically because they just want to include 16 cards per pack instead of 15. And if you just want more playables and more cards in the draft, you can just do that, right? Like that's a decision that's entirely open to you. If you want to increase your pack sizes, you can escalate the number of cards and still have every card in the draft come up. And I think that is a viable choice. I've seen people do it. I'm a traditionalist. I like 360, but that is an option that's
the number 360 just looks better than 336.
It's just satisfying. So if you go up to 450, which is another 90 cards, so it's a 25% increase in the total number of cards. What this does is it introduces variety in between drafts. So you're going to open up most of the cards, but not all of them. So that adds a little bit of variety. It does mean that you could be drafting towards a Blood Artist deck, and Blood Artist just doesn't get opened, which is not my favorite, personally. Oh, real quick, it should be mentioned that at 360 cards, if you're trying to like power max within a certain framework, like 360 is the way to get that done, because you just play the best cards and you don't play the cards that are weaker than the best cards, if that makes any sense.
Particularly on Arena, the card pools are such that when you go from 360 to 450, blue, for example, is one we bring up a lot, is losing a lot of value when you add those extra chafe cards.
Right, exactly. Sorry, Tank is defending the apartment from unseen threats. Go Tank. It's fun. He has a really, really goofy bark for a pit bull. He does not sound menacing at all. So at 450, if you want your themes to continue to work, or any size above 360 for that matter, if you want your themes to work, you got to add in a little extra redundancy. So I use like the Blood Artist example. When you go up to like 450, you might want to, if you're not playing like Zulaport Cutthroat, for example, you're playing like a variety of other effects, like you might want to toss a Zulaport Cutthroat in there to increase the likelihood that, that deck is going to see the density of effects that you want to see. You want to try to keep your ratios the same. So like not every red 1-drop is going to show up. So you like add a couple extra red 1-drops to make sure that people are probably going to get the number that they need.
Yeah, and one quick note on 450 is if 450 does support 10 players.
It does. That's our like primary reason for having one, honestly, is sometimes we get a 10 pod and you just need a larger cube to support.
Yeah, and we're not huge proponents of 450 for our particular environment, but if you have 10 players, you want something that supports 10 players. But it's worth noting that if you do have 10 players for your 450 card cube, that all the cards will get opened. It's only in the instances where you have 8 players drafting a 450 card cube, or 8 or less players drafting a 450 card cube, where some of the cards straight up don't get opened. So you need to go for that maximum redundancy. But if you're playing with 10 people pretty regularly, you will open an entire 450 card cube, so all the cards will be represented.
It does also need to be mentioned that things get a little weird at 450. I don't really know how to describe it. I think it's because things don't wheel the same way.
Yes.
But if you look at our decks that we get from our 450 unrestricted versus our 360, they just look a lot different.
10-player pods are strange
looking.
Yeah, it's just the way that it goes. Like the way that we do a 10 pod or a 10-player pod is like it's the same pack size, it's the same number of packs, but like by the time you hit pick 4, you're basically not going to wheel anything out of that pack. You know what I mean? Yeah. So like the wheel kind of like doesn't exist in a lot of ways. So 450 is like a really uncommon size. We maintain one to support 10 players. That's basically its only virtue, in my opinion. I would say that 540, Justin Parnell and Ryan Overturf's favorite cube size, hence the name of their podcast, the 540. Like between 360 and 540, these are the two most popular sizes. 450 is like not really something you see a lot. So at 540, 2/3 of the cards get opened. So again, you want to make sure you add like a redundancy of effects to make sure that like a certain number of them are present on average in the average draft. This is the typical number for WotC sponsored cubes, which I don't necessarily I know why they do it. I don't necessarily agree with why they do it, but like, do you have a note on this here?
Yeah, so my personal perception on it is that the extra variance of only opening 2/3 of the cube at a time gives it kind of this perceived replayability because the cube isn't typically very well balanced. And so you just don't always open the most busted power outliers. You just sometimes get a break from those. It makes a good streamer experience cube though, because it does have a lot of variety in what you're going to see. But especially in the arena card pool at 540, you get a lot of weird cards in there that just have no business being in these cubes, especially the main arena cube that is supposed to be like a powerful environment. You have some weird cards.
Right. Well, and I would also push, I'm not going to get on my like whole soapbox, like maybe a different episode is a better place to like climb all the way up on my box, but like I agree with the phrase perceived replayability, because the reality is that like, sure, the 2-drops that you open might be different, but they're still like aggressive 2-drops. Like the mid-rangey 3-drops, I opened different mid-rangey 3-drops. They're still just mid-rangey 3-drops. Like the play experience is not changing a whole lot, and all you're doing, in my personal opinion, is watering down the power level of the average deck. And I think that if a cube is designed well, there's a ton of different viable stuff that you can do even within a 360 card pool. Like you could draft a well-designed 360 10 times and never play exactly the same strategy. So I think 540 for me is like, especially if you're an older player who's been in the game a long time, and I think this is a totally viable reason to play 540. If there are just like a ton of cards that you really love and you just want to play all those cards and have them show up at different times, like especially if your cube is a representation of your personal collection or whatever, I think 540 is great. I'm not pushing back on 540 conceptually. I'm just saying I don't think that I don't understand why WotC insists on making their cubes 540.
I think it's interesting too because I think if I was playing in paper, I'd be a lot more open to the concept of a 540 because there's so many more paper cards available that you could fill out the cube you're trying to do. On the flip side, if you're playing a paper cube, how often are you actually playing with 8 people? How often are you playing this cube, and is 540 going to be something that you can physically maintain? So there's sort of this like weird tension there where I actually don't think it's practical to have a 540, even if it would make a better museum in paper. I think for arena play, though, you should just play 360 right now. There's not enough density.
Yeah, like how much variance do you need in the draft if you're playing your cube like every 3 months, for example? But again, as I mentioned, like people like to play with a lot of different cards, you know, especially people who've been in the game for a long time. They love a huge variety of cards. They want to play all of them. It's perfectly reasonable to play a 540. It's just not my personal preference. I think I've probably made pretty clear.
Yeah, in case you think variance is something you really, really need. I mean, we play the 360 unrestricted cube multiple times a week on average, and we still have people come up with new and interesting takes on decks. Like, you have obviously the ones that show up every week, but there's a lot of variety inside that 360 card pile that is still drafted like multiple times a week on average.
And a lot of the impetus for 540s and stuff like that is to make sure that you don't have a stagnant environment. But I think even at 360, you avoid having a stagnant environment by rotating cards a lot and doing, you know, consistent updates when new cards come out, especially in paper where you get access to all the like commander exclusive cards that you could be playing depending on, you know, what classification of cube you have and stuff like that. 540 is it's so weird to me. I believe the vintage cube on Magic Online is a 540 card cube, and look, it's what you want. You know, we said identify your goals. What do you want your cube to look like at the very beginning? If you just want that variance, if that's something you desire, then you know that's not our preference here. But if that's something that your players want and you want, then you know it doesn't hurt to do that. But it's so strange to me to use a really large cube size and still include like 2-card combo in that cube, because like imagine the Splinter Twin stuff, which I think actually just got cut from the vintage cube. I think Splinter Twin Kiki stuff is out of the vintage cube, but for the longest time that was a mainstay of vintage cube. In fact, people who replicate the vintage cube experience expect there to be like Splinter Twin there. But you know, if you open Pestermite in your draft but Kiki Jiki just straight up isn't opened at all in the cube, like it's just sitting in the pile of cards that don't get drafted, like why the hell is Pestermite floating around? You know, it's really strange when you have 2-card combos where the cards don't work individually that well, which you don't have that problem at 360, right? Because you know, you guarantee that the pieces of the combo are floating around in the draft whether you get them or not.
I think the other weird thing about Vintage Cube being 540 for Moto, and again, I get it because it's so played, you need to have a little bit of extra density, but when you're thinking about Vintage Cube, you're playing to play power, and so you want to open a lot of power. But on top of that, the power level differential between like the top, 30 cards in Vintage Cube and everything else is leagues. I mean, when you compare something like Minskaboo, Orcish Bowmasters, Moxes, Time Walk, things like that to like the run-of-the-mill cards, there is a gulf of power there. And when you add more and more cards to that and you make a bigger and bigger cube, it just becomes more varianced in a way that is kind of negatively impacting the experience. I've seen some tight 360 vintage cubes and I've played in them, and they're really, really fun. I actually think they're a lot more fun because your average deck is just absolutely insane. And some of these don't support combo, right? Like a lot of the really good ones that I've seen don't actually support the sort of storm package that's in the 540. And I know people expect that in the MTGO vintage cube, but really it's not a great deck on average. There are a lot of degenerate strategies you can support that aren't quite as narrow as the storm cards. And this isn't to hate on the MTGO vintage cube. It's a really fun experience. If you haven't played it, get an MTGO account. They give you a free pass every year and you can play it during the winter, and it's fun. I will say it's fun, but it doesn't mean it's well balanced.
All right, so I think we've made it pretty clear that we're going to rename the podcast the 360. Take that, Justin and Ryan. Speaking of Ryan Overturf, the next cube size we're going to talk about, and then we're going to move on. He refers to it as a tubert, which is specifically referring to the fact that like it's designed around the idea that you've only got like 2 drafters, maybe 4. And long story short, if you want to hear about tuberts, go back and listen to the catalog of the 540 episodes. First of all, it's a great podcast. And second, Ryan brings up tuberts a lot. There's a lot of tubert information in the 540. Short note here, it's 180, and it's designed specifically around the idea it's going to be drafted by like 2 people.
I know you don't want to hear this, people listening at home, but if you're trying to build a paper cube, this is your go-to. Most of you do not have the social group of Magic players that is going to facilitate an 8-person pod.
Yeah, nerds.
If you're all right. You guys are cruel. Yeah, well, it's in all seriousness, like if you're one of the individuals like posting on Reddit, like how do I draft my 360 with 4 players, or how do I draft my 360 with like 2 or 3 players? I think the right answer for you is probably just to own an 180 card cube. It's cheaper, and it's going to be a better draft experience than like seeing, half the cards in your 360 card cube.
Yeah, if your mom or dad at home and you're trying to teach your kids how to play or draft or something, the tubert's probably fine. I will say my personal favorite cube size is 361, so you get that just tiny little bit of variance because you never know what card wasn't opened.
The only card that didn't get opened is Yawgmoth in your mono black.
I was just thinking the same thing. It's always Yawgmoth.
Everybody has to sweat that the one card they're building around is the one card that wasn't opened in the draft.
It doesn't show up.
Welcome to the 361, everybody. Okay, target audience. So talk to me about, this is kind of bleeding into the identifier goals. Part of identifying your goals is also identifying the people that you tend to play with. A lot of people don't build cubes to go play with complete strangers. A lot of times they're playing with their personal friends if it's a paper cube. And you have you have to gauge what your players want from a cube experience. Maybe more so than what you want out of the cube experience, especially once you start playing with the same group of people over and over again, you'll get a feel for what their personal preferences are. So talk to me about how to kind of gauge your target audience for whatever cube you're building.
I was just going to say that most cubes, the kind of standard cube experience, assumes a few things about enfranchisement. They're going to include things that have keywords with no text, so no reminder text, just on rares and mythics. They're going to assume you know what all the keywords do. They're going to assume that, for example, going back to our talk about the Splinter Twin combo, that if you see Kiki Jiki in a pack, you are expecting your players know that somewhere else in the pack there's a Restoration Angel, or there's a Deceiver Exarch, or there's a Village Bellringer. There's something to combo with it. Right? If you include Kiki Jiki as a value card, you have made a mistake because there's a natural assumption built into that card being included in a cube. Newer players don't necessarily have that meta knowledge. Even beyond the mechanical knowledge of the game, the meta knowledge is really pernicious because that's where like a lot of people draft their first cube, a vintage cube especially, but in general. We call it the black green bad cards, or green black bad cards, or whatever. The green black 0-3 draft. And you draft this generic mid-range deck that looks supported in an environment that is completely degenerate and above what you can do with that.
And like
that
about combo. Yeah. On the flip side, like in an environment like ours, or even modern cube, like green black big cards is totally reasonable. In our environment, like really, really good green threats and black top end like Grave Titan with mana acceleration and Doom Blades, like you can totally go all the way with that. But as you mentioned, like someone going into the Vintage Cube for the first draft who hasn't like consumed content about Vintage Cube and hasn't really learned about what the environment's about, you draft like a generic fair mid-range deck in Vintage Cube, and you're just going to get like channeled or natural ordered, or somebody's going to cheat out Grizzlebrand, and you're just going to kind of shit your pants.
Yeah, right? And that's not to say you can't draft fair decks in Vintage Cube, but it requires a knowledge of the kind of interaction you're going to need to not be just out in the water, essentially.
Hand hate. On the flip side of that, so like the Vintage Cube is like an example of a cube that's designed for very enfranchised players who are familiar with these historically powerful cards, what they combo with, what it all does, etc. On the flip side, I can't remember, maybe like in the description we'll try to like find the creator of this cube so we can give them credit. I can't remember if I heard about it on a podcast or if it was a post on Reddit, but there's an individual who came out with something they called the Board Game Cube. So they have a board game night with their friends like every single week. and their friends don't really play Magic. So they wanted to build a cube that was playable by people who are not going to learn all the insane complexities ins and out of, especially of all the insanely complicated cards that they print nowadays that have novels on them. So their general rule is only French vanilla creatures with like evergreen keywords that can be explained once and easily remembered, or very simple to understand triggered abilities or activated abilities that are clearly, concisely explained on the card. So, like, Mull Drifter would be, like, a fine card for this environment, for example. It's not strictly, like, a French vanilla card. I think I'm making myself pretty clear, right?
Yeah, I actually think Mull Drifter is more complex than what they were doing in their cube. I think what they were talking about was, like, all right, so, like, the 2-mana Knight in most sets, where it's, like, it has first strike and it ETBs and makes a 1/1, right? That kind of card,
yeah, that
or
kind
like
of thing.
a 3-mana 2/2 flyer, you know, like
Right.
basically the concept is they wanted everything to be understandable in a single pass and have all the mechanics, the keyworded mechanics in the cube were things that you could, like he said, you could teach them one time and it would be understood what the card does, right? So flying is evasive unless they have a flying creature or a reach blocker, right? So it was basically about letting their board game group play Magic. And so most of their cards were from the core M sets that they used to do, because all of those had even evergreen keywords, keyword texted, right? So they would say what the keyword did. So you could read it on your card. You didn't have to know what all of them did.
Right, and then the rest of the cubes like kind of like filled out with like burn and removal and card draw, except it's just like really, really easy to understand like on your first pass. So like those are kind of the two polar examples of targeted for different levels of enfranchisement, right? On the one hand, you've got the vintage cube that assumes that you know what is going on when you sit down and will kind of punish you if you don't. On the other hand, a cube literally designed as a pick-up-and-play board game with very little teaching going on except for the very core fundamentals of how Magic works.
Most cubes are going to be somewhere in between that, leaning probably closer to the vintage cube side of things, I would guess.
Yeah, exactly. But like, if you're a Magic player who like has a bunch of friends that are like into strategy games or whatever, but don't necessarily play Magic, targeting the lower end of enfranchisement is like where you want to be, right? Because Magic is one of those games where if you throw a new player into an environment that has like every card has a book on it, they're going to get burned out and discouraged like really, really fast. So
I mean, we're enfranchised players, and I still glaze over when I start reading some of the new cards they print.
Oh yeah, I mean, I misplay sometimes even in our own cube because like I forget edges of things that cards have. I'm like, I know what that card does, and then it does this other thing that's kind of like situational text, and it's like, fuck, I forgot.
Does this red impulse draw last until the end of this turn, the end of the next instep, the end of my next turn? What does it do?
So moving on, the other thing you want to think about in terms of target audience is what do your players like to do? So this is really only a question that you need to ask yourself if you're leaning more in the direction of enfranchised players, right? If a lot of your players play like Vintage Cube online and they are really into combo, like you don't need to spend the money to buy the Vintage Cube. I mean, it's like as much as like a cheap car.
Cheap car?
Well, it depends. Yeah, I guess like actually like a mid-cost car in some cases. But if you don't want to shell out the money for like Vintage Cube, like the actual Vintage Cube, but you know that your players are Vintage Cube fans, you might want to target designing an environment that features a lot of combo and like over the top kind of blowout synergy style stuff. Do your players, and this may be true if they're relatively new, a lot of newer players or just some people in general never get used to it. Some people really fucking hate counterspells. And like they're just not going to be into it if your blue section contains enough cards for there to be 2 controlling decks on any given night, right? So if you have players that just like despise control or just want to resolve giant things and slam them into one another, take these things into consideration. If your drafters like kind of like a limited power level and they don't really enjoy it when games are over in like 4 turns, maybe don't support blisteringly fast aggro strategies. Mm-hmm. These are the kind of questions that you need to ask yourself about what your players like to do, because ultimately like there's what you like to do and that's important, but you want people to come out and play your cube. And if you design an environment that you really like and your play group is not into it, your cube's just not going to get played.
I do think there's an element of needing to, how do I put this? Occasionally you need to like protect players from themselves. And so even if your play group doesn't like control, there is a certain aspect of Magic's gameplay that linear aggro and control are kind of necessary evils to keep the game from revolving around playing mono 5 and 6 drop battlecruiser magics. And like maybe your players like that, but I think on average,
yes, they might.
I think on average most play groups are not going to enjoy sitting there trying to just bomb diggity each other until the other one concedes, because the interaction isn't good enough to deal with those.
You talking about standard?
Yeah. But like there are times where in cube consideration, and we go both ways on this in some aspects. So sometimes we cut things that we know are bad, that our players have, perhaps drafted higher than they should. Well, I think we cut like Retrofitter Foundry, I think, from the unrestricted cube because we all knew it was terrible, but people were like drafting it really highly and losing with it.
Yeah. I think some people would take umbrage with the statement that Retrofitter Foundry is a bad card, but people were putting it in decks that it did not belong in.
Right.
Another example is we had Coco in our cube for a while, and Coco was kind of like this really niche. It was like in a flex slot, kind of like green had everything it needed to do what it usually does. So we were like, okay, well, we'll put Coco in here as kind of like a cool reward for going like low to the ground, like Naya or Abzan or like Bant.
Yeah, it was like for Bant Soulherder, yeah.
Yeah, so like if you build your deck in a particular way, like Coco is really good. But the thing about Coco is like it really, really needs to be built around for it to not just generally be just like an okay card. And people were putting it in their like mono green decks. So at the risk of sounding like paternalistic, we were just kind of looking at it. It's like it's not like harmful from a draft perspective that it's here, but it just kept showing up in places that it didn't belong, and then players would be like, Coco's not a good card. And it's like, well, you didn't build a Coco deck.
Yeah, you just jammed it in your green deck.
Right. So eventually we're just like, okay, like people are going to continue to put this in decks it doesn't belong in and then have a bad time when they cast it and it's not good. So like, let's just cut it.
On the flip side of that, for example, in our Peasant Cube, we had a bunch of people trying to put Young Pyromancer in their mono red deck, which isn't awful, but it wasn't particularly supported. But we went through in one of the updates optimized. And we tried to add some cards that supported that. There were like instants and sorceries that would help the Young Pyromancer go wide. We added a little bit of extra density for that sort of mono red Pyromancer vibe. And that's kind of the other end of that, right? Is we saw players trying to do something that wasn't necessarily bad, but maybe was a little under-supported, and we gave that strategy a little bit of extra support to kind of make it more viable.
One thing I wanted to mention here in this vein about not being over complex and not getting people trapped with certain types of cards is the random typal text that we see on cards. Text that cares about specific kinds of creatures can lead people astray or send false signals to people that a certain type of theme is open that they might not be thinking, or that is not actually supported in your cube. So just as an example of this, imagine you're playing the card Pride Sovereign, which is a 3-mana 2/2 that can pay white and tap to make 2/1/1 cats, and then it gets bigger the more cats you have. That is a perfectly fine go wide card, but it also says the word cat on it, and people love typal text. So they will see that and they might think, okay, there's like some sort of cat deck here. And then they see what just so happens to be a cat in the next pack. Like you get past a lion sash or whatever that says cat on it. Okay, I'm drafting the cat deck. But as the cube designer, there is no cat deck. There's no cat deck. So you don't want to, accidentally push people into archetypes that don't exist. And typal text is something that can often do that for people. Another good example, Roaming Throne from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. That's the 4-mana 4/4 colors creature where you name a creature type, and then anytime a creature of that type triggers an ability, it triggers again. That's a perfectly fine card. You could just put that in a cube as a 4-mana 4/4 with Ward 2 that happens to bolster whatever the next type of creature you play is. But people will see a card like that, and they will draft around a specific creature type. and that can lead them astray. By the way, if my voice sounds a little bit different, it's because my recording messed up this time. I will take the blame for it. My recording messed up, so
I thought he was joking.
I
thought he was joking.
Tell us next. We literally
next?
finished this episode 10 minutes ago, and I was like, my recording my recording messed up. Yeah, and they're like,
good joke, Tim.
LOL. I'm like, no, really, my recording messed up. So the universe is telling us not to finish the Build-A-Cube series or even to start the Build-A-Cube series, but god damn it, we're finishing the Build-A-Cube series.
We are persistent. Another card that we actually run in our cube that falls into this vein, though, is a Svalin of Sea and Sky. So if you've not played with this card, it's a 3-mana 3/4. And the first line of text is, if you control 3 or more merfolk, Svalin is indestructible. The last line of text is, merfolk you control other than Svalin have ward 1. And the line we actually play the card for is sandwiched between the two. It's when this card attacks, you draw a card. And so we've had people mention before that, why are we playing this card? We only run 1 or 2 other merfolk. And it's like, that's one of those moments where it's like, we're not playing the card for the first or the last line of text. We're playing it because it's overstatted and it draws cards when it attacks and it plays well with your removal.
It's like if someone saw Scarab God and they're like, I'm drafting zombies, But I think most people understand with Scarab God that the zombie part is built into the card. You don't have to draft zombies. But this is all to say, Chris mentioned Collected Company. Don't include cards that are going to trick people into building a deck that's not really there. The typo stuff is a little bit wonky because a lot of people will understand that, as a standalone card, certain cards are fine. But if the card absolutely hinges on you supporting it with other creatures of that type or very specific kind of cards that aren't in the cube, you don't want to include that card because people will then draft it and end up kind of cornering themselves into a deck that doesn't really exist, which is not where you want to be. But we want to wrap this up with a quick discussion on power banding, and all three of us just act like we didn't have this exact discussion 15 minutes ago.
Works for me.
What do we mean by power banding? Well, power banding is roughly the difference in power levels across all of the cards in your cube. If you have an average power level, whatever that is for your cube, the power banding kind of refers to everything from your weakest card to your most powerful card and everything in between. And as a general rule of thumb, my personal preference, and I think all of our personal preferences here, which is not a hard and fast rule, is to avoid having power outliers. If the average power level of the card in your cube is a 7, it's okay to have some 8s, cards that stand out as really powerful cards. It's okay to have some 6s, maybe even some 5s if they're doing something specific for a theme or archetype. But what you don't want is a cube full of 7s that has a couple 10s, like cards that will straight up win the game on their own every single time, and you don't want a bunch of 2s and 3s floating around as well. This is something that Teld and Mop and I discussed in the previous episode about all of the alternative cubes, where one of the issues that came up with every single cube was we debuted the cube, people drafted cards that were way better than every other card in the cube, and they won with those, and we had to go through and do some chopping off the top, right? We had to cut those really powerful cards in order to make sure everybody had a fair chance, because the person who got, in my personal affinity cube, the person who opened the Gear Hulks was at a huge advantage over the people who didn't. And it, occurred to me, the Gear Hulks are 9s, 9 out of 10s in an environment full of 6s and 7 out of 10s. You don't really want that, because what's going to happen is your players are going to draft it. The person who got the 10 out of 10 is going to beat everybody else when they draw that card, and the people who lost are going to say, oh, this card was too good, I didn't feel like I had any way to deal with it. So avoid that. We do this actually quite a bit in our unrestricted environment right now, where we have started chopping anything that feels like it's a whole level above whatever the next most powerful thing is. Fabled the Mirror Breaker, not in our cube anymore. A lot of the green threats like Vorin Collects, like those 5-mana Gargadon type cards, the big Baneslayers, not in the cube. We avoided cards like Bonehorde Dracosaur and Breaches because they are just cards that can win the game on their own. Adeline is gone. We are taking an intentional approach to avoid in having cards that just win the game on their own in our cube. We want a flat power level, and we recommend that, or at least I recommend that, for anybody who's building their first cube.
Yeah, you want to have some of those if you're playing 7s, right? You want to have some 8s. You want to have cards that when you open them in a pack, they give you some direction, they give you some excitement. One card that, I almost consider this a power outlier at this point, but for example, the other night, I opened a Chrome Host Siege Shark in the Unrestricted Cube and ended up drafting a Jeskai control deck, but like the excitement I got out of opening up the Siege Shark, it was just like, I was like whooping in the middle of chat or whatever, and it was like, because it was really exciting. Like I like to, I like Siege Shark, and it's really powerful and it's fun. Right. And when you open like a Chandra or a Wandering Emperor or a, at this point, a Radagast, or a Nissa, there is some like excitement there where you've got this card that's going to give you some direction. It's going to be a very powerful thing you can center your draft around. And I think there's some good aspects of having that. You just want to be careful that those aren't cards that are going to single-handedly take over every game that they show up in, and that your skilled drafters can build around and just run the table, right? You want to make sure that they're cards that are within the fair range of power, acceptable power.
Yeah,
ranges.
The way that I guess I would frame it is, and I'm sure most people who are interested in Cube, have also played plenty of Limited, so you probably are familiar with this feeling. You know that feeling when you're playing like a nice game of Limited, there's back and forth, there's exchanging of resources, and then your opponent just lands that one Fable of the Mirror Breaker or Shieldred or whatever, and you're just like, well, nothing that happened up to this point really mattered that much. That's a pretty shitty feeling. Like I think you'd be hard pressed to find a player that's like, yeah, I really enjoy the play pattern of having an entire game canceled out by a single insanely powerful card. You're familiar with that feeling, that's the best way I can articulate why you sort of want to avoid that in your own environment, generally speaking. You do want some cards that, are exciting to like first pick and are maybe a little bit better than the others. That's totally fine. You are going to have some cards that are more powerful than others, no matter what type of cube you build. That's kind of just the nature of Magic cards. But just be cautious about how much of that shit you include in your cube.
And there are times where it's acceptable for a card to completely flip the table. We run the 8-mana Ugin in our cube, for example, and I think a lot of newer drafters tend to draft that card extremely highly because it has the ability to completely flip a game that you're have no chance into a
right, but that's fair because it costs 8 mana.
But also, it's 8 mana.
Almost never think about a card that costs 8 or more mana as a power outlier because it's a reward for actually getting to 8 mana, which just doesn't happen every game.
Well, if it costs 8, it should be a power
You
outlier.
expect it to win the game, right?
It virtually has to.
If getting to 8 mana is that easy, then maybe you consider it, but it's not a given that you get to 8 mana every single game, even in your ramp decks. The reverse of what we're talking about is true, too, where you just don't want those 3s and 4s hanging around because somebody presumably is going to draft them, and you don't want cards that either always end up in the sideboard or just don't pull their weight. So aim for flat power level with a little bit of, crests and what's the opposite of a crest?
peaks and valleys.
Peaks and valleys, that's better. Yeah, a little bit of waxing and waning in terms of power, but not like so much so that there are obvious standouts compared to the average power level.
It also helps if you have your extremely powerful cards be build-arounds. So, for example, one that we bring up a lot is Yawgmoth. It's one of the most powerful cards individually in our cube. But I think, Chris, the last recording, you said it best, that Yawgmoth encourages you to put a bunch of bad cards in your deck to really enable it. Like, you're putting a lot of these 1-mana, 2/1 black recursive creatures that are like 5 out of 10s. They're not bad. They're just not up to the power level of some of the other cards in the cube. But those are the cards Yawgmoth really wants to be surrounded with. Are those cards and cards that just make 1/1 tokens.
Sunfall is a good example of a build around because you don't put creatures in your deck and then you build around your opponent playing creatures. So, Sunfall, perfect example of what you want to be doing here.
God, Sunfall is so nasty.
If you really want to go with that, I guess you could do get the Zedra the Greathearted and donate cards to them. That way, when you Sunfall them,
yes, please put Zedra the Greathearted in your cube, people, and donate your cards away. I'm sure somebody out there is like, "But I have a Zedra in my cube." All right, well. Again, not super organic here as far as a closing goes because we just recorded this. So I'm going to blast through this closing and we'll go ahead and wrap this bad boy up. But just know that this is part 1 of a multi-part series, like I said at the top of the episode. We reserve the right to add in a new Build a Cube episode whenever we feel like discussing the topic. I know Chris is going to be excited to talk about the next kind of set of categories in this series. We're going to talk more, I think, about... The plan is to talk next about building out your monocolored sections and kind of choosing the what Chris calls the density of different types of effects that you want. So if you're like, oh, I want an aggro deck, I know I need like my 1-mana 2/1s and my 1-mana aggressive creatures. How do I figure out how many of those to play? How many cantrips do I play? How many draw 2s / counter spells do I play? How many mana dorks do I want? Things like that. Like, how are we going to actually figure out what the right numbers are, or an approximation of what the right numbers are for the different types of cards that I expect to see in my cube? So that's going to be a big focus of the next one. It won't be our very next episode. I don't know when we're actually going to do part 2, because I believe our next episode will be Murders at Karlov Manor, a set review for, the clue set, which I already asked like how excited people were about this, and Chris's answer was, it's a new set. So
make some noise.
I assume that means an average level of excitement.
I'm very excited to get hyped up about a set mechanic and then lose to a bunch of 1-mana 2/1s.
Yeah, it's going to be a good time in Limited. We're going to crack some clues, but...
I'll crack your clues.
Oh, hey, wait for us to finish the recording, maybe. Thanks as always, everyone listening. Remember, best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us, give us your feedback. Great place to hang out. It's been described by some of our recent members as their LGS, which is a great feeling. You got some people who just kind of hang out, share drafts with each other, and come out and do some cubing. It's always a fun time. You can draft our more powerful unrestricted cube on Sundays at 7:30 Eastern, our peasant cube at 7:30 Eastern on Wednesdays, sometimes an alternative cube in that slot, and then the 2:30 Eastern time for our UK drafters, also on Sunday, features a lot of our different alternative cubes as well. We also had a random draft fire-off on Friday and a random draft fire-off on Saturday, so firing on all cylinders with a bunch of different cubes and getting tons and tons of feedback and experience and meeting new people. So great time. Check out our socials. Twitter at JankDiverGaming, where I have been posting the trophy deck lists from our server across all of the different cubes. YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming, where you can watch me fumble through a couple Khans of Tarkir and either Kaladesh Remastered drafts. And you can find Teld at twitch.tv/TeldTalks.
Come join me and watch me complain about how unlucky I am.
That's going to go ahead and do it. Stay tuned for more of the Build-A-Cube series. Stay tuned for Karlov Manor set review, cube review, and stay tuned for future episodes of the 360 or the 361, whatever we're rebranding ourselves as. That's going to go ahead and do it. Thanks for hanging out as always, and we will catch everybody next time.
Black is the new black.
Yeah, nerds.
Cheap car?
Chris and his goddamn ideas all the time.
Make some noise.
Go Tank.
Bomb diggity each other.
God damn it.
Retrofitter Foundry is a bad card